So it's 1 o'clock. We'll probably get a couple extra people coming in, but in the interest of time, let's just get started. This is a panel discussion on minimizing regulatory burden for clinicaltrials.gov. Please feel free to put questions in the chat at any time. We'll be taking those throughout the session. And also let us know if you're currently an investigator on a study in the chat. Okay, so let's start off with introducing our panelists. We'll start with Dr. Alloway, and then Laura, Kara, and Jackie. Just giving your names, your roles, and a little tongue-in-cheek, what's your favorite or most challenging feature of dealing or aspect of dealing with clinicaltrials.gov?
Thank you, Angela. Thanks for everyone for joining us today. I'm Rita Alloway, Research Professor of Medicine in Internal Medicine at UC. I'm also the Director of Transplant Clinical Research, so I have a unique role as an investigator and also understanding the regulatory burdens that go along with doing human clinical trials. My favorite perk for clinicaltrials.gov is before I write any studies or I seek to get funding, I always review what studies are currently ongoing on clinicaltrials.gov to make sure that I'm not wasting my time. And that's been very helpful in a lot of occasions.
Thank you, Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Fossett. I'm a senior specialist in the Research Compliance Office at Cincinnati Children's. I have a number of different roles, but one of the hats that I wear is Institutional Administrator for PRS. One of the things I like about clinicaltrials.gov is being able to search all the various studies. And I also really enjoy using the PRS system because it has everything organized. And I'm looking forward to when beta comes out. So it'll hopefully be even an enhanced version of what we have.
Awesome. Kara?
Hi, I'm Kara Kliewer. I'm a clinical research manager at Cincinnati Children's, and I also wear a lot of hats. But one of the roles I have are managing a number of these clinicaltrial.gov submissions, including the initial registration and even entering the data and helping analyze it at the end. And I too like to look at data on clinicaltrials.gov and look at other studies and the results.
And Jackie. Oh, did I?
You're muted. I'm sorry. Hi, I'm Jackie Glass. I am the QA/QI auditor for UCHRPP IRB, and I am also the main point of contact administrator for CT.gov. I find the most challenging part of CT.gov is probably understanding exactly what PRS wants in order to help the investigators move their project through the timeline.
All right, great. So we're going to start with Laura talking about the requirements and timelines related to clinicaltrials.gov. So Laura, you want to take it to the next slide?
Right. There we go. So this is just as a big disclaimer, this is not about talking about the regulations, but we did want to provide just a baseline for everybody and a quick refresher, because we know this group is probably pretty well versed with the different regulations. So key clinical trial requirements and our main governing bodies are the FDA, NIH, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, and then the other ones that we also think about as well as posting for clinicaltrials.gov is Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, as well as the Department of the VA. And so to just kind of quickly go over for these studies, so the summary of requirements for applicable clinical trials, which is for FDA. The scope of studies that they're looking at is for interventional studies of an FDA-regulated drug, biologic, or device product. But it does exclude phase 1, single patient IND, device feasibility. There's actually a lot when you start to look at applicable clinical trials. So it is important to kind of dive in. They have a really great checklist. So if you do have a study and you're the responsible party, you are required to register your study within 21 days of enrollment, to do annual verifications, make sure you're updating it if there's major modifications. You are required to post your results and protocol or statistical analysis plan within 1 year of that primary completion date. And certainly they can have certain enforcements such as criminal proceedings and civil penalties. So moving on to the next one. So NIH funded clinical studies. Now, keep in mind that their definition of clinical trials are a little bit different with regards to requiring registration for studies than it is for the FDA. So they have a much broader definition. These are interventional studies. It can be of any phase and include behavioral studies, and they can be either fully or partially funded by the NIH. Again, this is just an overview. You can get into some nuances with this definition, and they have great resources on their website to dive into that. Their requirements look just like the FDA's with regards to registration timelines, annual verification, results posting, and protocol. But the added thing with NIH is that they do require that you post an IRB approved informed consent form after the study is close to enrollment and no later than 60 days after the last study visit by any subject. This is a tricky timeline, so it's just one of those things you got to think about. And certainly they can withhold or you can lose NIH funding if you're not meeting that guideline. And then the other one I'm just going to briefly go over is for publication. So the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. So any interventional clinical trial that has a health outcome, again, look at their website for a full definition of their policy. And their big thing is they really want you to register your study prior to enrollment. So notice that's a little bit sooner than the FDA and NIH. So usually I just tell people, if you're going to be publishing, just go ahead and get that PRS registration of that record sooner rather than later. So you're making sure you meet that deadline. You do have to make sure you're keeping up to date on it with annual verifications and modifications. They don't require results or protocol in a informed consent form. You certainly can, but you don't have to with regards to that policy. And if you don't have your study registered by their timeline requirement, you could be ineligible to publish. So again, that's a really brief overview. I could talk about this for a whole nother hour, but we just wanted to make sure everybody had a really good baseline. But with that, I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Alloway to give her perspective as an investigator.
Thank you, Laura. So basically, I want to try to give the investigator's perspective on the nuances with clinicaltrials.gov. And first, it's important to understand the different demands of the investigator. When you're thinking about writing a grant or obtaining any type of funding, obviously you want to obtain funding to test your hypothesis. And in the cases of which human subject trials are included in testing that hypothesis, you have to provide a human subject protocol in a concise manner. And quite frankly, that's typically very different from what you submit in your initial NIH submissions and other formats. The protocol is different in things that you have to include to, meet IRB requirements, etc. And when you're writing a grant, obviously the novel science is typically the driving force. We want to put as many of the novel science ideas in our grants to make sure we get the attention of the reviewers and have something novel and innovative and to increase our likelihood of get funding. But at the same time, sometimes our intellectual ideas are still potentially very fluid in nature, and they are prone to minute changes. When it comes to clinicaltrials.gov, however, you're required to collect and share the significant summary protocol information before and during the trial. And it's very rigid by that point. It's a very definitive protocol. As was mentioned before, they want you to summarize your results and adverse events within the timelines outlined of the conclusion of the trial. And the real purpose of this is to provide transparency to patients, investigators, and sponsors to build public trust. Next slide, please. And it's difficult sometimes to homogenize these goals. If you are not a clinical trialist or you don't have experience working with a human subject trial, I really encourage you to collaborate with a clinical trialist early. If the trial is multi-center and very large in nature, which can become more and more complex, consider collaborating with a clinical trial organization or some type of equivalent, but there are typically significant amounts of funding that are associated with going down that path. It's also important for you to interpret the protocol as written in the grant into a clinical trial protocol for regulatory purposes, study implementation, and clinicaltrials.gov reporting. And again, the protocol that you write for the grant may be very, very different from what you submit to the IRB or to clinicaltrials.gov. But as they go down that path, the protocols become more and more rigid. And again, kind of different from what your goals are from writing the grant, it's really important for you to simplify your primary and your secondary endpoints, because that's what's required for reporting in clinicaltrials.gov. And maybe use your tertiary endpoints for exploratory outcomes or things that may be something that you want to review the results at a later date. Next slide, please. So the current disconnect is, again, as I said, you're struggling to obtain your grant funding, and really novel science is prioritized. And unfortunately, to stay within your budget limits, sometimes the human subject proportion of the grant is woefully underfunded and unfortunately tends to be an afterthought. I would feel very strongly that the full cost of human subject research is underestimated and not fully understood by most investigators. And budgeted funds directly toward the human subject study are disproportionately utilized sometimes by data management groups to meet a lot of these mandates that we have for clinicaltrials.gov, et cetera, and not really allocated to the coordinators with boots on the ground and the patients where we're implementing these protocols. I call these basically I refer to these as clinical trial costs that are hidden, that may not be as visible to you as, say, a lab test or a chest x-ray, et cetera, that you may want to do when you come together to putting together your budgets. Next slide, please. So entering a study into clinicaltrial.gov, you have to understand that clinicaltrials.gov is designed to cover all clinical studies. And therefore, as a user, and believe it me, I've said it many times myself, you'll think that my study doesn't fit within clinicaltrials.gov. But the answer to that question is you have to make it fit. And that's why simpler is better. So some user pearls that I would advise to you, and reflect back on what Laura was talking about in terms of when you're entering your trial into clinicaltrials.gov, proper entering of the trial impacts your downstream events dramatically. Again, the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. I cannot emphasize that more, but then again, you have to understand that what's in clinicaltrials.gov has to match what's in your protocol. Again, enter your study in the most basic and simple form possible. when you're begin to balance, entering your trial in regards to prior to study enrollment, for publication purposes, you really need to realistically enter the study start date and the completion dates. Because when you enter those dates in clinicaltrials.gov, the clock starts ticking. And that's when you're starting to get reminders and messages to enter additional data. And you start getting on the delinquent list when you haven't met those timelines. Your estimated primary outcome completion endpoint is going to be the date of the last participant was examined or received an intervention or data collected. Of note, this has absolute no relationship to the timing of data analysis. And once your data collection has ended from clinicaltrials.gov, they're expecting the results in a timely manner. Another important goal is determining the intervention arms and the groups that are important, because all your results and your adverse events are going to be reported based upon those arms or groups. It's also, you have to remember that it's the responsible party identified as the sponsor or the PI that is the responsible party that could be on the hook for some of the obligations that are required when you're not meeting these clinicaltrials.gov expectations. And unfortunately, and this is what has been one of the most frustrating things to me, is reporting requirements will change going forward and from clinicaltrials.gov. And when they change, those new reporting requirements are retroactive to all active studies. And that's why I say that you need to try to close your studies in a timely manner to just close the loop on clinicaltrials.gov. Next slide, please. So reporting the results, again, the results and adverse event must be reported within 12 months of the actual date of your completion of the data. The results must be reported within 30 days of FDA approval. Other reporting elements must be current in terms of overall study status, actual completion date, enrollment, etc. And just some user pearls is the overall study status must be consistent with the study start and completion dates. It cannot just be listed as recruiting or not yet recruiting. The enrollment must be actual or the same as the number that's stated in the participant flow. And the results section must be consistent again with the intervention names in the protocol or the group names in the protocol. Next slide, please. When it comes to closing the study, reporting requirements unfortunately will change. And when they change, it's retroactive. And again, I just encourage you to close the studies in a timely manner. Next slide. So about disseminating the results, historically, the investigator was focused on basically just your final report to the sponsor, the NIH, etc., and then manuscript publication in a high impact journal. Now you really have to put a lot of emphasis and focus on registering your results in clinicaltrials.gov. And unfortunately, I like to say that this is the gift that keeps on giving or taking, whatever your perspective may be. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to the next presenter.
All right. So what I would like to talk about today is a little bit more on the practical side, and it will tie in quite a few things that Dr. Alloway just presented. So I'll talk a little bit about, the practical side of registering a trial, maintaining a trial, and results reporting. So this has been stressed before, but a study must be registered because one, it's the law, but for journal publications. Increasingly, if a study isn't registered prior to enrollment, you'll be unable to publish it. So this is really driving factor for a lot of groups. So in terms of registering a study, one of the best resources that I found is listed here, and it's a document that shows all of the data elements that and defines them that you will have to enter when you register a study. And these data elements fall under 12 broad categories. They're listed here. The first 6 are really quite simple and self-explanatory. They're just basically study identification and information, sponsor information. But as Dr. Alloway mentioned, it gets a little bit more complex when you start talking about study design and arm and interventions, where it's good to get things right from the beginning and really closely align with the protocol. So we'll talk about each of these separately. So in terms of study information, as I mentioned, this information is generally straightforward. But a key tip is to try to use these data element definitions so that this doesn't get kicked back by PRS. For example, it seems quite self-explanatory just to add a title, but the title really should be in lay terms. It seems explanatory just to add a brief summary, but that also too should be in lay terms and also present a hypothesis. And all of these details are in this data element definition guide. So if you follow that closely, it's easier to just sort of track through each of these initial study information registration forms and submit. And one of the other tips is, to always define acronyms. Almost on every form, simply because this will prevent PRS from kicking it back that they don't understand the term. And one other tip is if you provide a really good brief summary, it can be a recruiting tool. A lot of patients searching for trials, will read this lay term description and see that could potentially be, a trial for me. So the next part starts getting just a little bit harder, and that's the study design. The PRS system supports 3 types of study types. That's interventional trials. It supports observational trials and expanded access. And the requirement is to define what the study's purpose is and put the study phase. But probably most importantly is selecting the appropriate model and the number of arms. And I think that cuts to Dr. Alloway's statement about my trial doesn't fit. If you feel like your trial doesn't fit any of these particular types of study models that are selectable, or you're uncertain about the number of arms that you should use in a particular study, reach out to PRS. I've always had a good experience with them giving hints. They've seen all sorts of clinical trials. Most trials will fit in a standard format, but if it's a little bit more complex, they'll advise this is the best way we've seen this structured. So those are good hints in terms of getting help when you're stuck. So the next slide shows a little bit of detail regarding entering arms and interventions. If it's an interventional trial, there are hints throughout the data element guide, but also with embedded instructions within each of the required fields. So for example, when entering an arm title, you can see at the bottom it says use a generic name. And then please, in the description, give the dosage and the dosage frequency and the duration. So simply just following the directions again will save you a lot of time. The form won't be kicked back by PRS, for corrections. And also, some of this I found is a little bit redundant, but again, to limit, to cut to Dr. Alloway's point again, keep it simple. And try to not be redundant yourself. So for example, if you've already described the intervention in the arm, no need to go in great detail again in the intervention description. And this is probably one of the greatest challenges I feel with the system is it looks a little clunky. So if we just entered what I showed you in the previous slide and had, for example, a parallel intervention with 2 arms, it's going to look like this shown in the top of the slide. So it takes a while to get used to this layout. It's more of a table form that we don't see, for example, journal publications in. But in general, once you get used to this view, it's easier to understand. So next slide. So the next entry, and probably the hardest, unless you have a really clearly stated study protocol where you have measurable outcomes like Dr. Alloway talked about, structuring your protocol and keeping it simple with your primary and secondary outcomes, this will be easy. You simply add the primary endpoints with a short description, the same with each secondary endpoint. PRS does ask that you enter all other pre-specified endpoints. However, as Dr. Alloway mentioned, we are not required to actually report results on, for example, exploratory outcomes. So that, of course, saves time. And also just in terms of writing a protocol, if something is not that important and it really is going to be exploratory, for the purpose of CT.gov, it can save you a lot of time to have fewer, secondary outcomes and keep those exploratory outcomes as exploratory. Then the next section for entry is eligibility. And that is mostly just a cut and paste job of all your inclusion and exclusion. But this is also important to be accurate because, again, this too can be a decent recruiting tool, either for patients or potentially other medical professionals looking on the websites for studies for their patients. And then the last sort of important point I wanted to make is about data sharing. This is becoming more and more important with journals, but it's also a requirement for entry into CT.gov. And that is you need to answer whether or not you plan to make individual participant data available at the end of the study. And so you just simply check yes or no or undecided. But the important point is that if you want to share data with other researchers, then of course that needs to be aligned with what you're asking the patients to consent to. So that's just an important reminder for that. So I'll turn it over to Laura, who's going to talk a little bit about maintenance once you have this initial entry approved.
Okay, so maintenance of your record. So you've gotten registration taken care of, and now it's on to maintaining your record. And this is certainly important. We want to be transparent to the public and make sure we have all the information as accurate and up to date as possible. So keep in mind the record can be updated at any time. You can go in there and make adjustments as needed. If you do have protocol amendments that are going through, make sure you're thinking about PRS and update that. And then again, as I mentioned before, record verification is annually, so every 12 months. Be sure you go in and just do a quick review to make sure everything is up to date. There are certain modifications that do require faster turnaround. So, and again, this is a little bit of the nuance of the regulations, but so responsible parties, you're required to make these updates and any status changes within 30 days. And then if your investigational drug has been approved by the FDA or biologic, you must also update that within 15 days. So just kind of tips. So for annual verification, I sort of think of this as, like habit stacking, right? Like you are going to be doing a continuing review to the IRB, or perhaps you're doing reporting to the FDA or grants reporting. Anytime you're doing sort of these reports out, think about PRS, think about, oh, I should go in there and just make sure that everything's up to date. Click that verification box and have that released out to the public. So then that way your record will always be up to date and you're not going to get those problem lists on there. Major modifications. Again, if there's a responsible party changes, the FDA has approved the drug or clearance it. Also, if there's things like you've added a study site, or that study site status has changed. That's important for the public to know. Again, if families are, patients are looking for studies, it's important for them to see, oh, there is a site open by me. So it's really good to make sure that's up to date. And then other things to think about too is when your enrollment's closed, if you've decided to withdraw or terminate. So again, making sure it's up to date. You've completed it. You want to close it down, as we talked about before. So then that way everything is correct. And then keep in mind that primary completion date and study completion dates are important to make sure that they are accurate. So. And Carol, I'll hand it back over to you.
Okay. So now that you've maintained your study and your study is over and it's time to submit the results, the way we think about it here, it's similar to preparing, for a manuscript for publication. And sometimes you might already have that manuscript completed prior to entering this data. And just like a manuscript, it's important and probably best practice that people that are familiar with the study design and the data analysis, need to be involved in putting together the data for CT.gov submission, because they are the ones that can accurately summarize it. But some additional tips for those people and others that are helping are, again, I would like to refer people to these data element definitions. That's the second link here. But there's also a how-to report, and these aren't very long instructions. They're very short instructions they're very helpful and help guide, with the entry. And just like with the original submission for registration, there are broad categories of data that need to be entered. And those 4 broad categories for the results section are participant flow, the baseline characteristics, outcome measures, and adverse events. So in terms of the participant flow, this is something that does very closely align with a journal submission. If you've completed, for example, a consort diagram, you can just think of the participant flow that needs to be entered into CT.gov as a table version of it. This is a little bit older of a study, but the same principles still apply. And it shows how this consort diagram, you can easily insert the information from that into this table form. And that's what CT.gov will require. And then on the next slide, if this isn't data that you are publishing or haven't published it yet, the CT.gov website has a number of templates that you can print out and use to guide you for data entry or even the analysis. Like, this is the data that I know I have to enter, or in this case, the participant flow. And you can fill out this information, making it easier when it comes time to enter it, to upload it to CT.gov. And in terms of baseline characteristics, again, this is very analogous with a journal publication. This is sort of like your demographics table and your baseline characteristics table. And the required characteristics for CT.gov are age, sex or gender, race and ethnicity, and of course your study specific measures. And most of the time, the study specific measures are going to relate to your outcome measures. And one of the tips here is that if you have an outcome measure that is changed from baseline, there's no doubt it needs to be in the baseline characteristics, or it will be flagged and PRS support groups will have you added. So on the next slide, I show sort of the key data elements for these study specific baseline measures. It's pretty self-explanatory, but you obviously have a title of a measure and you need some sort of measure type, mean, median, and its precision. But one of the other often the scenarios that's come up for us is, sometimes you don't have a baseline measure for every single patient enrolled in the study. And if your N is different for a baseline measure than it is for the overall study, you need to explain why. So again, just like I mentioned previously, a lot of these instructions are embedded in the CT.gov entry field. So you can either use the data guide, data element guide, or these instructions that are embedded. And part of this too is cuts to the point. This is where a statistician input is important, or a knowledgeable investigator that has either provided data that has all of this information or is entering it themselves. So the next part is probably the hardest part, and it's really two parts. It's entering the outcomes and the statistical analysis. So in terms of outcomes, it's obviously going to match the outcomes that you entered when you registered the trial. If you made a mistake during registration and perhaps didn't frame it right, or wasn't simple enough, you can change and make updates to this. You can change them, but also redefine them, make simple updates. But importantly, what needs to be entered here are the actual results and the type of measure again, and it should match what you entered as baseline characteristics as well. And just to reiterate, only the primary and secondary outcome results are required. You do not have to enter exploratory or other specified results if they aren't primary or secondary. You can if you want, but it's not a requirement. So similar to the baseline characteristics and the participant flow, there are also templates available on CT.gov that you can print out. This one's filled out as an example, and also the examples can be used to help drive how you enter the data. But this also kind of helps speed up the process of entry if you already have some sort of template for the data entry part of entering the data. So the second part of the outcomes is the statistical analysis. And the statistical analysis should really match the statistical analysis plan that often is embedded in the protocol, but could be separate. And this is the part that's really critical too for the statistician or a knowledgeable investigator to be involved. The type of analysis that's done, the statistical tests that are done, you have to be entered, and of course you want those to be accurate. And every outcome that is entered requires the statistical analysis entry. And finally, the last entry are the adverse events. And this includes, of course, any mortality, serious adverse events, and just all other adverse events. And typically you need to be prepared to enter the number affected, the overall number at risk, the AE term, organ, system, etc. You can limit the number of AEs by defining a frequency threshold for AEs. You would want to do that if, to keep it to the most relevant, but you can also enter all AEs if you desire. So this is just a summary of sort of from registration to maintenance to submitting your results, that I personally have found that these data element definitions guides are the best source for determining what to enter. Our team has found that if there are 2 or 3 people involved, generally an investigator, almost always a statistician, and a coordinator to enter the data, that is best practice in terms of getting this right. Sometimes this can take some time. So if you're up against like an actual deadline of, you're at your year point, it's best to give yourself more than an hour to get this data entered. And then I've also found that the PRS is very helpful with questions and really quick in my experience. And then finally, I have put one final resource that shows all of the different study types, parallel design, crossover studies, and gives examples of what the data would look like with those particular study models. And those are good resources as well.
Thank you. That was great. So just to circle back, if for people on the call, for UC, the University of Cincinnati, for instance, Jackie, if someone needed to set up an account and get assistance with their clinicaltrials.gov record, what's the process and what are the resources?
If you need an account with UC, you would contact, I'm your main point of contact. Angela and Karima they support me if I'm unavailable. And I will create an account for you and you'll get a notification from me when that's completed with your login information. And you'll also be contacted by ct.gov. And then you can get started. If you need access to a record, anyone that already has access can add you to the record. If they are unable to do so for any reason, you can reach out to me and I can add you to that record. As far as dealing with the PRS, the best thing to do is to refer back to what you've entered. They will have a list of, you'll be able to go into their questions or their kickback and see what they've said or what they're asking for. And if you still, we do have helpful flyers and links. And if you're still having problems, you can definitely, as everyone else has said, is reach out to PRS directly. There's a contact PRS button and they are very helpful. And I do find that with those helpful tips and those pages and the documents that I do send out when you register with contacting PRS as your last resort, that the majority of people are able to get through the record.
And Laura, for children's, who were the contacts and what are the resources there?
Sure. So you can always contact me and then I can set up your account. There's also for various departments. You could contact the department administrator, but if you don't know who that is, just reach out to me and I'm happy to help. As far as resources, the department administrators are great resources. Again, me, and then we also have a really great and robust internal website with all sorts of tools and resources and other things that information, helpful links to regulations that can help along the way.
And we're still open for questions inside of the chat, but we did have one person ask about how long it takes PRS to review the information once you've entered the outcome measures and statistical analysis. And Kira responded that it can be from as little as 1 week up to 4 weeks. I have seen where sometimes it takes, there are some outliers in there where it can take a couple of months, but you are able to, once you submit, track that information inside of the record. But if you're having back and forth with PRS to work things out before you submit, you just want to make sure that you're tracking that information too. So if you get questions about delays on your record, that you have documentation to kind of show action that you've taken. Let's see. So a couple of questions too about dealing with PRS with comments and questions. Do you guys have any general tips or tricks when it comes to doing that correspondence. I know that there's the link up in the upper right-hand side of the record to email PRS, but then it pops out to an email on your screen that's not managed in the system. So how have you guys handled corresponding with PRS and keeping track of your correspondence?
It's been a while since I've had to do that, but I recall using that email function. And I think that history is saved, or I was able to save it. But the response was almost immediate, like within 24 hours. I had a response, and there was back and forth over a period of days with that. But to be honest, I can't recall how I saved that information.
Rita, have you had any correspondence and how have you managed it?
The correspondences that we have had, it has just left me with a lot of, I guess, frustrations, but because I haven't been able to resolve all the questions. And it's primarily when they add new additional questions or comments to old studies, or data was collected differently than they're asking for it. Now, granted, I've been working with it since it was first initiated, and maybe I have a lot of leftover tension from those times. But that's been kind of the most frustrating thing, is I feel like I can never get it closed. I could never just move it on and get it out of my to-do box.
Oh, and Elizabeth Copra, somebody said in the chat, there's no way to track changes. So she prints out the results in PDF and saves it every single time before she does an update. So yeah, and I would definitely agree with Dr. Alloway. You can get different responses from PRS related to similar study records, or get additional queries on things that you thought were resolved, because there are new reviewers looking at it all the time. And I don't know, Laura, if you have any tips that you hand out to people on how to handle that when that happens.
Usually if people get stuck, I'll usually, have a quick meeting with them and sort of go through point by point of the PRS comments. Usually we just email them right from like our Outlook. You can just take their email address, and then that way it's easier to save that correspondence. But then it isn't attached in the system, so that can be a little frustrating. But yeah, usually if you just go point by point and explain it, they have been really helpful and very responsive.
Awesome. We do have about 12 minutes if anybody wants to put any additional questions in the chat. Did you guys have any additional tips or tricks that you wanted to share? Jackie, did you have any?
I think that to stay on top of your record instead of trying to wait until it's gone past a certain point and you're trying to catch up to give them what they want is helpful, to kind of stay on top of your record, and also to refer and to try to answer in the way that you input the information into the system, because if you don't, then it confuses PRS because it's not aligning with how you actually set up the record.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, I would recommend lots of screenshots. Sometimes it's not uncommon, especially if you're trying to make edits to a record that's been open for a really long time, and you're making responses to PRS. It's not tracking all of your changes. So if you just start going in, making a lot of changes and you're not tracking it, and then you need to go back and revise that, it can be kind of difficult. So definitely tracking as you go, on top of not trying to keep pace with the timelines and requirements is important. So we have about 10 minutes, but I think we could probably give people some time back. Since I don't see any additional questions, thank you for the comments that are and questions that were in the chat. We will have the link and the slide deck posted online for you guys to access. And any closing remarks from the panel? Well, good luck, everybody. Good night and good luck. We are closing. Take care. Thank you.